autumn of 1939 arrived in Minnesota with a chill that seemed to seep into the bones of everyone who lived there. It was a time when the Great Depression still cast its shadow over the nation, when families struggled to make ends meet and communities held together through sheer determination and mutual support. In the small town of Windham, nestled in the southwestern corner of the state, life moved at a slower pace than in the cities. Neighbors knew each other by name, children played in the streets until dusk, and the local general store served as a gathering place where news and gossip were exchanged with equal fervor. It was in this close-knit community that a tragedy unfolded, one that would haunt the town for generations and remain unsolved for more than 8 decades. Her name was Margaret Louise Hendrickson, though everyone in Windham called her Maggie. She was 23 years old, a schoolteacher at the local elementary school, and by all accounts a gentle and kind-hearted young woman. Maggie had grown up in Windham, the daughter of a farmer and his wife who had worked the land for as long as anyone could remember. She was the youngest of 4 children, and her parents had been proud when she decided to pursue teaching, seeing it as a path to a better life than the backbreaking labor of farming. Maggie loved her students, and they adored her in return. She was known for her patience, her warm smile, and her ability to make even the most difficult lessons seem manageable. On weekends, she helped her mother with chores around the farmhouse and attended services at the Lutheran church where her family had been members for decades. On a crisp October evening, Maggie left the schoolhouse after staying late to prepare lessons for the following week. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the quiet streets of Windham. Several people saw her walking toward home, her arms full of books and papers, her coat buttoned against the cool air. She waved to the postmaster, who was locking up for the night, and exchanged a few words with Mrs. Anderson, who was sweeping the steps of her boarding house. Everything about that evening seemed ordinary, unremarkable in every way, but Maggie never made it home. When she failed to arrive for dinner, her parents grew concerned. Maggie was punctual to a fault, and it was unlike her to be late without sending word. Her father, Henrik Hendrickson, walked the route she would have taken from the school to their farmhouse, calling her name and asking anyone he encountered if they had seen her. As darkness fell and there was still no sign of Maggie, panic began to set in. Henrik returned home and gathered a group of neighbors to help search. They spread out across the town, lanterns in hand, combing through alleyways, checking abandoned buildings, and calling out into the night. The search continued through the early hours of the morning, but there was no trace of the young schoolteacher. The following day, the entire community joined the effort to find Maggie. Volunteers scoured the fields and wooded areas surrounding Windham, while others questioned anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual. The local sheriff, a man named Walter Olson, took charge of the investigation, coordinating the search efforts and interviewing witnesses. Sheriff Olson was a respected figure in the community, known for his fairness and his dedication to keeping the peace. But a case like this was unlike anything he had encountered before. Missing persons were rare in a town as small as Windham, and the thought that something terrible might have happened to Maggie weighed heavily on everyone involved. 3 days after Maggie disappeared, a farmer named Elias Johansson made a discovery that would confirm the worst fears of the community. Johansson was checking on a section of his property near a creek about 2 miles outside of town when he noticed something unusual partially hidden beneath a fallen tree. As he approached, he realized with horror that it was a body. Maggie Hendrickson had been found, but she was no longer alive. She had been brutally attacked, her life stolen in an act of violence that seemed incomprehensible in such a peaceful town. Sheriff Olson was summoned immediately, and he arrived at the scene with a small group of deputies to begin processing the area for evidence. The location where Maggie's body was discovered was remote, accessible only by a narrow dirt path that wound through farmland and brush. It was not a place that anyone would have stumbled upon by accident, and investigators believed that whoever had committed the crime had chosen the spot deliberately to conceal it. Maggie's clothing was torn and disheveled, suggesting a struggle, and there were signs of blunt force trauma to her head. The county coroner, Dr. Harold Swenson, examined the body and determined that Maggie had died from her injuries, though the exact sequence of events remained unclear. There was no obvious motive for the crime, and nothing appeared to have been stolen from her person. Her books and papers were scattered nearby, as if they had been dropped in haste. Sheriff Olson and his deputies began the painstaking work of collecting evidence from the scene. They photographed the area, made sketches of the layout, and gathered samples of soil and vegetation that might later prove useful. They also searched for any personal items or clues that could lead them to the perpetrator. A torn piece of fabric was found snagged on a branch, and a set of footprints in the soft earth near the creek suggested that someone had been there recently. The footprints were measured and documented, and investigators hoped that they might be able to match them to a suspect. But in 1939, forensic science was in its infancy, and the tools available to law enforcement were limited compared to what would come in later decades. The investigation into Maggie's death consumed the town of Windham. Rumors spread like wildfire, and suspicion fell on various individuals, some with good reason and others based on nothing more than hearsay. A drifter who had been seen passing through town around the time of Maggie's disappearance became a person of interest, but he was never located. Another man, a farmhand who had worked on a neighboring property, was questioned extensively after someone claimed to have seen him near the schoolhouse on the evening Maggie disappeared. However, he had an alibi that seemed to hold up under scrutiny, and Sheriff Olson eventually concluded that there was insufficient evidence to charge him. The lack of progress in the case frustrated both the investigators and the community, and as weeks turned into months, the likelihood of finding the killer began to seem increasingly remote. For Maggie's family, the loss was devastating. Her parents, Henrik and Ingrid, were inconsolable, struggling to make sense of why anyone would want to harm their daughter. Maggie had no enemies, no romantic entanglements that might have led to jealousy or conflict. She was simply a young woman trying to make a difference in the lives of her students, and her death felt like a senseless act of cruelty. Her siblings, who had been close to her, were left grappling with their own grief and anger. The family held a funeral service at the Lutheran church, and nearly the entire town attended, filling the pews and spilling out into the churchyard. The pastor spoke of Maggie's kindness and her dedication to her students, and many in attendance wept openly as they said their final goodbyes. As the years passed, the case of Maggie Hendrickson grew cold. Sheriff Olson continued to work on it whenever he could, but other responsibilities demanded his attention, and new leads were few and far between. The evidence collected from the scene was stored in the sheriff's office, filed away in boxes that gathered dust as time went on. Maggie's parents never stopped hoping for answers, but as they aged, the burden of not knowing who had taken their daughter from them became increasingly difficult to bear. Henrik died in 1953, and Ingrid followed a few years later, both of them having carried the weight of their grief to the grave. The town of Windham, too, moved on, though Maggie's murder was never forgotten. It became a piece of local lore, a tragic story passed down through generations, a reminder of the darkness that can intrude even into the most peaceful of communities. Decades passed, and the world changed in ways that would have been unimaginable to the people of Windham in 1939. Technology advanced, societies evolved, and the tools available to law enforcement became increasingly sophisticated. By the early 21st century, DNA analysis had become a standard part of criminal investigations, capable of providing answers in cases that had once seemed impossible to solve. Forensic scientists could now extract genetic material from evidence that was decades old, comparing it to databases of known offenders, and even using genealogical research to identify suspects through their familial connections. It was a revolution in forensic science, one that promised to bring closure to families who had waited years, even lifetimes, for justice. In the autumn of 2024, the current sheriff of Cottonwood County, where Windham is located, made the decision to revisit several cold cases that had languished in the department's files. Sheriff Linda Borgstrom was a firm believer in the power of modern forensic technology, and she had seen firsthand how DNA testing had solved cases in other jurisdictions. Among the cases she selected for re-examination was the murder of Margaret Louise Hendrickson. The evidence collected in 1939 had been preserved, albeit under less than ideal conditions, but Bergstrom believed there was a chance that biological material might still be recoverable. She reached out to the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, which agreed to assist with the analysis. The evidence from Maggie's case was transported to the BCA's forensic laboratory in St. Paul, where a team of scientists began the delicate process of examining it. The torn piece of fabric found at the scene was a particular focus, as it was believed to have come from the clothing of the perpetrator during the struggle. Using advanced techniques, the scientists were able to extract trace amounts of DNA from the fabric, material that had been invisible to investigators in 1939, but was now detectable thanks to modern technology. The DNA profile was partial, meaning that it did not contain a complete genetic blueprint, but it was enough to potentially identify a match if the right comparison could be made. The next step was to upload the DNA profile into CODIS, the FBI's national database of DNA profiles from convicted offenders and evidence from unsolved crimes. The process was painstaking, requiring careful analysis and comparison, but the results were worth the wait. After several weeks, the system flagged a potential match. The DNA from the fabric found at Maggie's crime scene bore a striking resemblance to a profile already in the database. However, the match was not to a convicted offender, but rather to a familial relative of someone whose DNA was on file. This meant that the perpetrator was likely related to the individual in the database, and further investigation would be needed to identify the exact person responsible. Forensic genealogists were brought in to assist with the case. These specialists used DNA data in combination with genealogical records to construct family trees and identify individuals who may be connected to a crime. The process is labor-intensive, requiring researchers to sift through birth certificates, marriage records, census data, and other historical documents to piece together familial relationships. In the case of Maggie Hendrickson, the genealogists worked backward from the database match, tracing family lines and looking for individuals who would have been living in or near Wyndham in 1939. After months of work, they identified a potential suspect, a man named Raymond Carl Fisher. Raymond Fisher had been born in 1915, making him 24 years old at the time of Maggie's murder. He had grown up on a farm just outside of Wyndham, the son of German immigrants who had settled in the area in the late 1800s. Raymond was known in the community, though not particularly well-liked. Neighbors described him as sullen and withdrawn, someone who kept to himself and had a reputation for being quick to anger. He had worked various jobs over the years, including a stint as a laborer on local farms, but he had struggled to hold down steady employment. In 1941, just 2 years after Maggie's death, Raymond had enlisted in the military and left Wyndham, never to return. He had served in the Pacific Theater during World War II and had been discharged in 1946. After the war, he had settled in California, where he lived until his death in 1987. The revelation that Raymond Fisher was a potential suspect in Maggie's murder sent shockwaves through the investigation. Detectives began to dig into his background, looking for any connections between him and Maggie. They discovered that Raymond had lived less than 3 miles from the Hendrickson farm and that he had been in the area at the time of Maggie's disappearance. There were also reports, though unverified, that Raymond had been seen near the schoolhouse on the evening Maggie was last spotted. However, he had never been questioned by Sheriff Olson or his deputies, either because he had not been considered a suspect or because he had managed to avoid attention. The fact that he had left town shortly after the crime, though it could have been a coincidence given the timing of his enlistment, now seemed significant. Further investigation revealed that Raymond Fisher had not led a law-abiding life after leaving Wyndham. Records showed that he had been arrested several times in California, including for assault and disorderly conduct. Though he had never been convicted of a violent crime on the level of murder, his criminal history painted a picture of a man with a propensity for aggression. Detectives also learned that Raymond had married and had children, and it was through one of his descendants that the familial DNA match had been made. A grandchild of Raymond's had voluntarily submitted their DNA to a genealogical database, unaware that it would one day be used to link their grandfather to an unsolved murder from the 1930s. With this information in hand, Sheriff Bergstrom and her team faced a challenge. Raymond Fisher was long dead, and there was no possibility of arresting or prosecuting him. However, the DNA evidence strongly suggested that he was responsible for Maggie Hendrickson's death, and the investigators felt a duty to bring closure to the case, even if justice in the traditional sense could not be served. They decided to present their findings to the public and to Maggie's surviving relatives, hoping that the revelation would provide some measure of peace after so many years. In early November 2025, Sheriff Bergstrom held a press conference to announce the resolution of the case. Standing before a room full of reporters, she outlined the investigation that had led to the identification of Raymond Fisher as the suspect in Maggie's murder. She explained how modern DNA technology and forensic genealogy had made it possible to solve a case that had remained unsolved for more than 85 years. Bergstrom acknowledged that while Raymond was no longer alive to face justice, the findings represented a significant breakthrough for the case and for the family. She also expressed her gratitude to the forensic scientists and genealogists who had worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. The announcement drew widespread media attention, both locally and nationally. For the residents of Windham, many of whom had grown up hearing the story of Maggie Hendrickson, the news was a revelation. Some felt a sense of closure, relieved that the mystery had finally been solved. Others expressed frustration that the perpetrator had lived for decades without being held accountable, dying peacefully in California while Maggie's family had suffered. Still others questioned how Raymond Fisher had managed to escape suspicion in the first place, wondering if a more thorough investigation in 1939 might have led to his arrest. The surviving members of Maggie's family were contacted by investigators and informed of the findings. Her great-niece, a woman named Claire Hendrickson Peterson, spoke to reporters about the impact of the news. Claire had never known her great-aunt, but she had grown up hearing stories about Maggie and the tragedy that had befallen her. Learning that the case had been solved, even if the perpetrator was no longer alive, brought a mixture of emotions. Claire expressed gratitude to the investigators for their dedication and to the advances in science that had made the resolution possible. She also spoke about the importance of remembering Maggie not just as a victim, but as a person who had lived a meaningful life and had been loved by many. The case of Maggie Hendrickson highlighted the potential of modern forensic technology to solve even the oldest of cold cases. The DNA evidence recovered from the fabric found at the crime scene had been preserved for more than 80 years, a testament to the foresight of the investigators who had collected it. While the tools available in 1939 were primitive by today's standards, the careful documentation and storage of evidence had made it possible for future generations to revisit the case and uncover the truth. It was a reminder of the importance of preserving evidence from unsolved crimes, no matter how old or seemingly hopeless they might be. The resolution of the case also sparked conversations about the role of forensic genealogy in law enforcement. The use of DNA databases to identify suspects through familial connections had proven to be a powerful tool, but it also raised questions about privacy and consent. In Maggie's case, the DNA match had come from a voluntary submission by one of Raymond Fisher's descendants, someone who had no idea that their genetic information would be used in this way. While the outcome had been positive in terms of solving a crime, it highlighted the need for clear guidelines and ethical considerations when using such databases for investigative purposes. For the town of Windham, the resolution of Maggie's case was a moment of reflection. The community had carried the weight of the unsolved murder for generations, and the news that it had finally been solved brought a sense of closure, even if it was bittersweet. A memorial service was held at the Lutheran Church, where Maggie's funeral had taken place all those years ago, and residents gathered to honor her memory and to acknowledge the efforts of those who had worked to solve the case. The service was attended by members of Maggie's extended family, law enforcement officials, and many longtime residents of Windham who remembered the stories their parents and grandparents had told about the young schoolteacher whose life had been tragically cut short. The investigation also prompted a re-examination of other cold cases in Minnesota and beyond. Law enforcement agencies across the state began to look at their own files, identifying cases that might benefit from modern forensic analysis. The success in solving Maggie's murder demonstrated that even cases from the early 20th century could yield results if the right tools and expertise were applied. It was a hopeful message for families who had been waiting decades for answers, a reminder that advances in science could bring justice even when all hope seemed lost. The story of Raymond Fisher, meanwhile, became a subject of intense scrutiny. Investigators worked to piece together as much of his life as possible, hoping to understand what might have motivated him to commit such a terrible crime. The picture that emerged was one of a troubled individual, someone who had struggled with anger and aggression throughout his life. Whether his enlistment in the military had been a genuine desire to serve his country or an attempt to escape the consequences of his actions would never be known for certain. What was clear, however, was that he had managed to evade justice for his entire life, living out his years in California, while the family and community he had devastated continued to suffer. The resolution of Maggie's case also brought attention to the limitations of the criminal justice system in the 1930s. Law enforcement in that era lacked the resources and technology that are now taken for granted, and investigations were often hampered by a lack of training and expertise. Sheriff Olson and his deputies had done their best with the tools available to them, but they had been unable to identify Raymond Fisher as a suspect. Whether this was due to insufficient evidence, a lack of leads, or simply the limitations of the time, the fact remained that a killer had gone free. It was a sobering reminder of how far forensic science had come and how much more effective modern investigations could be. As the weeks and months passed, the story of Maggie Hendrickson and the resolution of her case continued to resonate. It became a case study in the power of perseverance and the potential of modern science to right old wrongs. It also served as a reminder of the human cost of unsolved crimes, the families who lived with unanswered questions, and the communities that carried the burden of unresolved tragedy. For Maggie's family, the resolution brought a measure of peace, a sense that justice, however delayed, had finally been served. And for the town of Windham, it was a moment to honor the memory of a young woman who had been taken from them far too soon. The case also underscored the importance of community support in the aftermath of violent crime. In 1939, the people of Windham had come together to search for Maggie, to support her family, and to demand answers. That same spirit of solidarity was evident in 2025, as residents gathered to remember Maggie and to celebrate the resolution of her case. It was a testament to the enduring bonds of community and the collective desire for justice, no matter how much time had passed. The advancements in forensic technology that had made the resolution of Maggie's case possible were part of a broader trend in law enforcement. DNA analysis, forensic genealogy, and other modern techniques had transformed the way crimes were investigated and solved. What had once been impossible was now routine, and cases that had languished for decades were being reopened and re-examined with fresh eyes. The success in solving Maggie's murder was just one example of this trend, but it was a powerful one, demonstrating the potential for science to bring closure to families and communities that had waited far too long for answers. For Sheriff Bergstrom and her team, the resolution of the case was a source of pride and satisfaction. They had taken a case that had been cold for more than 80 years and had brought it to a conclusion, providing answers to questions that had haunted a community for generations. It was a reminder of why they had chosen careers in law enforcement, a validation of their commitment to seeking justice for victims and their families. And it was a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of never giving up on a case no matter how old or difficult it might seem. The story of Maggie Hendrickson is ultimately a story about time, memory, and justice. It is about a young woman whose life was stolen in an act of senseless violence, and about the family and community that refused to forget her. It is about the passage of decades, the evolution of science, and the determination of investigators who believed that even the oldest of cold cases could be solved. And it is about the hope that justice, no matter how delayed, is always worth pursuing. For Maggie, that hope became a reality more than 80 years after her death, a testament to the enduring power of truth and the resilience of the human spirit.